So I'm really excited to have Matt Holmes from Intellect Frontier joining us today on the UK AI podcast. So Matt, welcome to the podcast. And could we start off by you telling us a little bit about yourself and what Intellect Frontier does?
Sure. I'm Matt, and I started Intellect Frontier about 8-9 months ago with my co-founder Sean. And it started off as an initiative for natural language analytics. So basically the belief that we can take conversations between humans and LLMs and unveil very useful insights into the user based on those natural conversations. So whether that's in education, so how do people learn with LLMs, and is it beneficial or not beneficial? The certain behaviors that they use, and kind of tied to that sort of talent identification. So can you identify soft skills such as conceptual thinking, hypothesization, metacognition, using these conversations? And so we really worked to develop the university partnerships along those lines, and build it out. But then we partnered with some folks over in the US called Civitas, who had been working on a program for a number of years with NIST. And it was called the ARIA program. And this was really focused on how do you test LLMs for long-term consequences from a human-centric perspective. How can you look at an LLM, any LLM model, and try and understand some of the more nuanced biases that are within that model? And so I like to quite call it interpretive bias. So bias comes in many, many flavors, whether that's representative bias, cognitive bias, statistical bias. But there's also interpretive bias, which is you are using an LLM, you are interpreting the information in a certain way, whatever that is, whether you are a leisure customer just using ChatGPT, or whether you're an analyst in health insurance using a chatbot, or whether you're a learner in education. The way that you interpret the information being presented to you is a whole new world that needs to be analyzed beyond simple guardrailing of, does it say something incorrect? Does it say something inappropriate? Because some of the more negative consequences of LLM use are going to be in that long tail information. So it's really, and what their work did was to say, how can you identify some of those human-centric biases, and how can you attach metrics to them? How can you attach reports to them to give to people to say, this is the consequence of this LLM model. You're probably not going to like it, company X, therefore we suggest you alter the training, alter the data put in, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that's fascinating. So, you know, we talk to so many businesses who are doing different things with LLMs, but I don't think they have really sort of thought about the consequences of how those LLMs are set up and the outputs of those. And it sounds like what you're doing is actually really taking that deep dive into the LLMs to understand the inputs, the outputs, the processes, and what the consequences, what the risks are for businesses. So I think it's a really interesting to find out more about. I've got a lot of questions that I'd like to get into this with you. But you know, you touched upon how organizations are starting to use LLMs. Are there some misconceptions that they start off with? And do you think, you know, one of those big challenges is that a lot of organizations see LLMs as being quite black box?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the perception that LLMs are a black box, I mean, on one level it's true, right? So they're very, very complex machines and inherently somewhat random. And so there's always going to be this black box element of things. But I feel like because the big boys, OpenAI, Anthropic, all that, have these base models that are so complex, and it's very, very difficult to actually untangle the data to make it as transparent as possible. I sometimes feel like, because there's no regulation in terms of data transparency, it can sometimes be used as somewhat of an excuse to say, okay, it's a black box, we don't need to look at it because the regulation says we don't need to look at it. Obviously, it costs money to actually untangle these things, and therefore to treat it as a black box is almost the easy way out. And I think that misses a lot of the angle of responsible usage. I think there's this enormous angle to all of this, which is bigger than just testing, which is responsible usage. In my opinion, that involves data transparency and the need for data transparency. So I think there's this misconception that that's just the status quo, to say, okay, it's a black box, we don't need to look at it. And I think in part that's tied because there's no regulation tied to it, and in part tied to the fact that the current status quo is that, oh, it's too complex, and so we can give that answer to anyone that asks.
So it sounds like you have an opinion and maybe some experience there on how we could actually start to open up that black box. One of the things I've been looking at over the last couple of weeks is what ways there are for either third parties to almost retrospectively reverse engineer the output to try and understand what's in the black box, to see what the input was. But are there other ways, other techniques that you know of being able to understand what's happening in that black box?
I mean, from a technical perspective, no. In terms of the actual specifics of what would be involved, in my opinion, I have absolutely no answer for how we untangle the black box for people like Anthropic and OpenAI, because it really is incredibly complex. The job is almost already done. That, in my view, is probably impossible to really truly untangle. But I think what we can do is give transparency to the models that build on top of them. So you've got a healthcare bot, you've got an education chatbot, whatever it is. What you really want to do is say, okay, any data, any additional data, any fine-tuned data, any data that uses RAG to connect up different data sources, that needs to have a paper trail. And I think that's really my view, to say, okay, maybe we're too late on the black box of the enormous neural networks in place, but that doesn't mean that what we build on top of it can't be transparent.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. And without wanting to go too far down that sort of that discussion, because there's we can have a whole webinar just talking about kind of transparency of black boxes. So there's so many other topics to cover off here. You talked a little bit about sort of red teaming and the way in which organizations look at analyzing what's working, what's not working, the performance metrics. You've got experience of deploying these types of projects. What are the metrics that really matter when an organization is trying to figure this out? And what are the sort of metrics that really help with things like deployment? So
I think from our perspective, and this is really the core behind our initiative, is that a lot of companies even with traditional guardrailing, does senior leadership have the information required to make informed decisions on LLMs in their environment? And I think for the large part, the answer is no. So you can put metrics ascribed to inaccuracy rate, for example, or hallucination rate, and those are fantastic and they need to be done. Or model collapse risk, or systemic model performance metrics, and they're very critical and they will continue to be very critical. But then there's these other metrics, these other things that you can report, such as bias risk, such as over-agreeability. I think over-agreeability is a point that is really I mean, it's really quite popular right now because everyone was going crazy over ChatGPT's update the other week, where it was very, very sycophantic, and they rolled it back. But that kind of thing, over agreeability, for example, is something that needs to have metrics added to it, because you can't just say, oh, it's over agreeable. You could say, okay, train your workforce to mitigate that. But in many scenarios, that's not what you really want. So say, for example, in mental health, and you've got a chatbot that is talking with patients, they're saying to the mental health sufferers, oh, you need to be educated on how to use it, is a no-go. That's irresponsible usage or irresponsible deployment. And so really what you want to do is attach metrics to these kinds of things, like over agreeability or risk of over reliance and things like that. I think mental health is a really good way to convey that, because it's, vulnerable users. You can't just say educate yourselves, and the risk of some of these more long tail impacts is particularly magnified. I always think, just as an example, and this isn't necessarily a real world example, a hypothetical, is and we're working in the research space in mental health, hence why I mentioned it, because there was an initiative focused on how generative AI can help with mental health diagnosis or treatment. And so we're involved on the testing side of a couple of these researchers. And I think a really good example is bipolar disorder. So bipolar disorder obviously involves periods of manic episodes, periods of depressive episodes, and over the course of weeks and months. And if you have someone with bipolar disorder using a chatbot, and say you want to early detection, for example, so you want to identify periods within those episodes that indicate that they're about to have a manic episode or they're about to have a depressive episode. Number one, that's enormously potentially useful. But number two, if you release a chatbot into the wild and you haven't tested for these kinds of metrics, these more ethereal metrics, for example, over agreeability with bipolar, say they're exhibiting symptoms of delusions of grandeur, which can actually spiral into manic episodes. And all of a sudden you've got a chatbot that's very agreeable. It somewhat encourages that behavior, and you actually have a chatbot that may well induce manic episodes. So that's just an example of where you have to be very, very careful, because that's an ultra high consequence area that you can right now, according to the regulations, according to the rules, you can kind of just release it into the wild in some of these high consequence areas, and without actually having the metrics to say, okay, this is at risk of this, or the user is at risk of this, and this. Those kinds of risks may become reality sooner rather than later.
Yeah, it's fascinating. You're looking at the way in which the machines can affect human behavior effectively, and we're focusing a lot on the metrics, as you say, which are very technical about the performance, but they're not really thinking about these higher level, high consequences, you called them, ways in which machines start to influence. But is that sort of a field that you think is sort of starting to evolve now, that people are really starting to study how humans and machines are interacting? Because I know there've been fields, human AI interaction as a study for a couple of years now. And are you starting to see that this is something that people are really thinking about, how it affects both customers and employees?
Yeah, absolutely. I think with the research initiative that I worked on for the mental health side of things, which was over the past couple of weeks, it was very, very enlightening to talk to all these people, mostly sort of over in the US at various universities. And it was really fascinating because obviously inherently we were just saying, we're testers. We're going to test this. We're going to increase your validity, reduce bias, things like this. But then also talked about what we were trying to do. And a lot of researchers over there were saying, you know, I've been thinking about this second order effects, but there's not really and more and more of them took a big interest on it. In fact, we're thinking about bringing somewhat of a centralized space together to actually talk about this kind of thing, because it seems like, you know, there are a lot of researchers with these kinds of questions, and to get everyone on the same page. And I'm not saying there's nowhere in the world where there is some sort of centralized space, but at least for the people that we've been talking to, bringing them together and having those kinds of conversations, everyone's on the same page. What are the second order effects is really, really important. And someone asked me a really, really good question a couple of weeks ago tied to that, which was, do you ever have a hard time describing the phenomenon that you're trying to describe, like the interpretive bias? Do you ever have a difficult time giving words to it? And I was like, yeah, absolutely. And I think our work in its current state is only just the beginning. Like, you can ascribe over agreeability, you can ascribe risk of over reliance, but I think the potential of these second order effects needs much, much deeper research. I think it's only just beginning of the psychological phenomenon that can happen between this interplay between LLMs and humans. And I think, yes, we can go to businesses, we can go to anyone developing LLMs and give these more ethereal metrics, as well as the more solid metrics with systemic testing and red team testing. But I think there's this whole ocean of research that is still needing to be done, where, like I said, those names will be given to the phenomenon, you know, over attachment, and what are the consequences of over attachment to LLMs for high risk populations, things like that, you know. And yeah, it's all about, I view it as professionalization of this practice, because I think when you don't embed it in academic rigor, there's very much, and I've seen it around, this risk of mythicization of a lot of the terminology. So, you know, it kind of is into this sort of pseudoscience, conscious transcendence kind of talk, which is, on one hand, I get it, because it's absolutely trying to find terms for these phenomenon for interacting with humans and LLMs, but at the same time, that very much unprofessionalizes it, and it gives risk to it veering into that pseudoscience side of things, when these are very real psychological phenomenon, and they need to be studied by the academics, and they need to be given professional terms and things like that. So yeah, one branch of our work is not just the testing side of things, but the acknowledgement that this is much bigger than what we're currently doing, but there's so many unknowns that it really needs a bit of an academic effort behind it.
Yeah, so many things you mentioned there really sort of resonate, I think, with what we as the industry body are looking at in terms of trying to build the guardrails, because the whole technology is so new. The industry adopting it and the companies adopting it are so often struggling with new challenges, or their new organizations or old organizations trying to, you know, bring this in. So it's very hard to now have those guardrails in place. But I think what you're saying is absolutely right. There's a lot of these challenges which we're discovering, which have such significant potential impact. We really need to be figuring these things out. You mentioned trying to sort of bring people together to explore this in more detail. I'd love to talk to you further. I mean, that's very much what UKAI is here to do. So maybe we can help to actually sort of bring that conversation, make it happen in some sort of roundtable or discussion, and actually make that happen. But I think, you know, if we sort of think about this from a future regulation perspective, what do you think that we should be doing as a sort of a society, and maybe as a government as well, in terms of how we create regulation. And if we are regulation or guidelines, what should the priorities be within that?
Yeah, I mean, obviously I'm going to be very biased with that because we do testing, and therefore we view testing as a critical part of that regulation. I think from my perspective, if, in our sort of dream utopian world where regulation is in its right spot with AI deployment, I think there's a number of areas that need to have standards behind them. Does your LLM adhere to this standard? And part of that is what we're doing, right? Has it been tested from a systemic point of view? Has it been tested from a red teaming point of view? So both in silico, i.e., automated red teaming and things like that, but also real world red teaming. And then field testing, using subject matter experts to create the best proxies possible, the best scenarios possible to fully test, fully test the whole stack. And in fact, there was an article that someone released very, very recently. Ethan Mollick released an article, might have been yesterday. I think it was yesterday, that was essentially talking about, organizations and their need for, he called it a lab, right? And the lab is using, you've got an LLM, whether it's your own, whether it's something you've adopted, and that's where you test it. That's where you do the testing prior to deployment. That's where you test it post deployment, see how adoption is. And that kind of testing, or that kind of idea of testing, I think was really, really good. And I think when you fit that into regulation, I think there needs to be some sort of standards around, you need to have proven that you've tested it in a way that shows responsible usage. I think that's our view. And I think it doesn't limit it to just testing. Obviously, that's what we're interested in. But I think, my view is the 3 T's, right? You need to test it, you need data transparency, and you need to train your workforce or your users. And I think those 3 T's go a long way to some sort of beginning of responsible usage standards. There's other elements of it as well. You need to, for example, post-deployment monitoring is an absolutely critical part. You can't just release it into the wild and say good luck. I think there should be standards around a certain period of time where you need to monitor performance. You need to monitor real world scenarios, not just proxies and scenario-based situations. And so I think there needs to be a pipeline almost of what that responsible usage, and I keep using that term, responsible usage, looks like. And it's the pipeline of responsible usage. In order to deploy something in healthcare, because obviously that's a high consequence market, what does responsible implementation, what does responsible testing, what does responsible monitoring look like? It's all within the context of healthcare specifically, but I think something like that is actually really, really good.
Great. There's things that I think you and I should talk a lot more about this, because this really aligns and resonates with a lot of the projects that we're working on. And I'd love to sort of take this offline and get more into the details, because all of the frameworks there around responsible AI, I think that's something which it sounds like you've got a lot of really, really interesting ideas. In particular, I think what you're talking about there, about rather than just seeing this as a transaction, as sort of a one-off process, looking at the longer term consequences, both on the human and on the organization. That's a really interesting dimension that I must admit I hadn't really thought of in full, but it makes complete sense. We're going to have to start to sort of wrap things up, but I know you've talked about research a little bit, and I just wanted to sort of understand, what's your view on where the research is is there a lot of research at the moment? Is there good stuff happening, but it's very theoretical, not really sort of tested in the practical sense, or is it that that the research just isn't there yet?
I think we're in the early stages. I think we're very much in these baby stages. I think red team testing and the consequences of red team testing and single prompt or multi-prompt, I think that's been tested a little bit more. Even that, companies are only just familiarizing themselves with that idea in order to release their LLMs. So I think there's a good body of research around there, but it's early. In terms of this more ethereal, long tail consequence stuff, that really it doesn't have a good body of research around it. And I think it really does need to be deepened over the next few years. I think we posted a NeurIPS paper, a paper to various policymakers and institutions in the US. And that paper, which I'm not sure whether it's posted yet, it might be about to be posted, but that paper is essentially a piece around opening that question to say, red teaming isn't good enough for comprehensive testing. It's a critical part, but it needs more. And then opens up this possibility of, okay, we need to go deeper into it. Number one, from a organizational perspective, i.e. organization X, you need to consider doing this. But then also from a research perspective, you know, a question to academics to be like, yes, we can do this, but it goes so much deeper. And so I think we're very much in the phase right now of trying to get the word out there to say this kind of work really needs to be done. And I'm not saying that no work at all has been done on it. There are papers out there and there's been some really fantastic work. But in terms of the phase at which we're at, I think we're very much at the baby steps.
Yeah, really interesting. So really sort of quick question and quick answer maybe for this last bit then, which is there one question that you wish every business leader would ask when they're thinking of deploying an LLM?
I think the best thing is, you know, if it was any other technology, would you feel like you have all the required information to make an informed decision on it? I think that's the main thing, because I think with any other piece of technology, you as a senior leader would need all the information that you need to actually make that decision to deploy whatever it is. And so I guess the question to them would be, okay, so if that's the case with an LLM, do you feel that's same level? If not, then perhaps you need to find better data to answer those questions prior to deployment, because it can be a potentially very high risk endeavor to deploy LLMs. And I think, yeah, I think people need to realize that.
Yeah, really interesting. Well, Matt, one sort of last question, I suppose. I know people saying last question, but which is really just how can we stay in touch with you and Intellect Frontier and find out more about your work?
Yeah, sure. So, well, first of all, our website, which is just intellectfrontier.co.uk. And we're, you know, on LinkedIn, everywhere. So I'm Matthew Holmes. So yeah, getting in contact through that is perfectly valid. And I think those are the two main methods. Yeah.
Amazing, excellent. Well, Matt, we've covered some really interesting topics there, and I've actually really valued your insights there. I've learned a lot from this, so thank you very much for that. I know our audience will really find it valuable as well. Thanks very much. It's been great to have you.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Cheers.